call this meeting to order. Our short matter of business is to approve the September 17th minutes, which we were at Horseman and Mount Wilson's.
I move to approve the minutes.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And with that, let's turn over to you.
Yeah, thanks guys. Good evening everybody, or late afternoon, wherever we're at here. You saw my district communication yesterday about the Iowa School performance profiles. We received this data, I don't know, was it 2 weeks ago already, Lucas, in an embargoed fashion? Yeah, and so since that time we've been processing what those results mean for us and for our district, and tried to build some understanding to share some additional level of detail here with you guys tonight. I think the important themes from that communication yesterday are, of course, this is one measure to look at our school performance, but there's a lot of other measures we try to look at to also show our school performance and highlight some of the successes and areas we need to improve. And so I think our constant work with the community is to just not use this as the sole measure to determine the success or struggles of any one particular school. I think we have some interesting data to share with you tonight. There's definitely some areas of work ahead for us in terms of, I think, some positive growth things that'll happen for our kids, about some changes we can make and some opportunities that we can build from the foundation of these results, and then some other just good things that we're continuing to do and see some positive results on as well. So Lucas is going to handle the bulk of this presentation for us tonight, and we'll try to let him work through and then of course address any questions you have with that. So with that, I'll let you take her off, Lucas.
All right, appreciate it, everybody. I reserve the right to some commentary along the way. That may or may not be solicited. We gave this presentation.
I'm excited now.
I can't wait.
3 times.
I don't
We
know
gave
if he
this
did.
presentation 3 times when we met with admin last week. So last Tuesday was the first time our administrators had seen their profiles with it being embargoed up until then. So we had met with elementary principals separate, middle school principals separate, high school principals separate, just kind of talk through the changes and how that ultimately impacted where their profile landed at, and then kind of talk through what those next steps are going to be. Since then, I have especially been trying to figure out the rationale behind some of the changes, in addition to what some of the changes mean for us. So some of that information I'll be able to share with you tonight. Some of it's still ongoing, so I may not have some answers if you do have certain specific questions tonight. But again, I'm going to kind of go along the way. I'm going to pop back and forth between some slides as well, but don't hesitate to kind of stop along the way if you need some clarification on it. So the first part, really, I just want to kind of go over the background of what is the Iowa School Performance Profile, as well as the scale that's now used to categorize our schools, what our district results are, and ultimately what's next for our district and for our schools that go along with that. If you're not familiar with the Iowa School Performance Profile, this is part of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So our state has to have an approved plan that they go by. Our state had a plan for the previous years up until this year, which is new. So this had to be approved. They provided it to the federal government last year. They did provide some examples or give us a little heads up of what this was going to look like, but some of the things kind of caught us off guard still at the very end. So you'll kind of see how the profiles are determined based on some of the categories that I'll go through. So what you see here is the current scale that's used. And my next slide is going to show you what it looked like in the past. So I'm going to jump back and forth between the two of these so you can see the differences between the two. Elementary and middle schools are there along the left-hand side. High schools are there along the right. You see in the parentheses the ELA, so those are English language learners. So the 700 and the 900, the total points for each of the levels, would remain the same, but if you don't have any ELL, which us as a larger and diverse district, have enough to fulfill all the requirements to have ELL as part of the scoring indicators for our district. So again, that makes no difference to us, but if we were a district without that, the growth would be 200 in those areas instead of just 100, because they wouldn't include the English language learners. So again, I'm going to come back to this slide here in just a little bit, but you can kind of see some things that I kind of want to point out. The proficiency and growth had the same weighting on them this year. You're not going to see that in how we scored or the scale that they used in the past. Some additions that you see on this for this year is the attendance growth. The post-secondary readiness has always been on there, but there are some changes in how that was tabulated. In addition to what you do not see on here, that is no longer a component, is the conditions for learning survey that we always administered at the same time as the statewide assessments. That is no longer a requirement from the state of Iowa, which luckily we have some other things about how we gauge our student experience in our system, but that will no longer be a requirement from the state.
And that we sent to parents and students?
The conditions for learning, yes. I mean, you're given that kind of a heads up ahead of time, and a preview of what that conditions for learning test would be.
But it was direct feedback from our parents and our students about how they thought the school was.
No, that was
No.
HRS
Oh, okay.
surveys.
Parents
This is
did not
strictly
take our
given to
conditions
students.
for learning, just the students.
Oh, just the students?
Just the students.
But so it's direct feedback from the students about their
Yeah.
learning. The
Anything-
state doesn't care about that anymore.
We don't do
Correct.
that.
Anything from
Okay.
their academic experience to their social emotional experience.
Okay, just
I like
wanted,
that question.
yeah, I just want to make sure I was tracking that.
You got that.
Okay.
So I'll come back to this one in just a little bit, but you can kind of see in the past of what the scale was used and how it was viewed. So again, the big changes you see here is the difference between proficiency and growth. I can give my opinion about the growth and the proficiency piece. Being in a building that was high FRL, high diverse population, we knew some of our students were coming into us with a lot of skills that they didn't necessarily have. So we knew that we could catch them up as much as possible, but maybe not catch them up to proficiency. So we really banked upon our instruction and our skills as a staff to try to make sure that our students can meet the expected growth. So maybe where we didn't fall as high with proficiency, we were able to catch up with growth. So we put a lot of stock into growth. But asking the state, then we got a little bit of clarification about what was the rationale for the change in proficiency and growth now being equal weighting, is that they value both as important. And both things as important should consider that both have equal weighting.
So, Lucas, what is that, what are the percentages for math and ELA in the right hand part of that slide under growth? What is it, what does 15.5% mean?
It was based on the total points available. So one of the reasons they also changed is they also feel that this is a lot cleaner and easier to understand this year.
Then this.
So this
Than
was
the
the
previous
old
year.
one, but the
This is the
15 and a half and the 15 and a half would have equaled that 31% of the total weight that
Yeah.
grows. So it took the weight of math, the weight of literacy, combined them to get your total.
So does that mean that 15% of the students who took the math assessment?
No.
It's 50% of the total score.
Huh?
It's how much of the percentage affected the score.
This is like the grading scale, Charlie.
So it's
So
really not helpful.
No.
No.
And it's the old system anyway, so. no.
But it's helpful to show the difference, to Lucas's point.
Yeah.
31% of our score used to be based on how much we could grow kids over the course of a year. And only
Now it's 22.
8% was based on proficiency. Now they're equal, Charlie. So in a district like,
Okay, so if we're
In the
comparing
school.
this year to last year.
Yeah, just to show you the
we can
differences.
compare that. Is that right?
we're trying to frame what we're going to show you when we look at our schools this year, where they rank compared to where they ranked last year. So
Well,
trying
not
to show you
just-
the frameworks.
sorry,
Yeah.
not just equal, and then Mitch will get your question. Not just equal, but if you look from 31% of the total score to not only now valuing proficiency as much, but some of those growth factors down to what's that say, 11%? You know, so the grading scale's changed, right? That's basically what I tried to communicate in the message, you know, and the de-emphasis of growth overall is what we've seen in a kind of a re-escalation of proficiency, which if you remember the old No Child Left Behind stuff, that's what everything was focused on, was proficiency, right? There was no growth factor really indicator there. Mitch?
The other thing that wasn't mentioned on growth yet, that it is also a standardized scale compared to the rest of the state. So if you're 50, 10 points above is one standard deviation above, 10 points below is one standard deviation below, and it also netted in factors like free and reduced lunch, student level factors like free and reduced lunch, ELL, things of that nature. So now that's another reason why growth, in my opinion, is a better metric, because it's netting out those other underlying
Other
factors.
factors.
Yep.
And so what this means is we could have a kid come to us from overseas with no English
Mhm.
under their belt, and we've never taught them. Maybe they come a month before the test, so they're obviously going to fail. And we're going to get deemed for that failure under proficiency, even though we've never had a chance to work with that kid. And we could bring that kid along dramatically
Yep.
and get them, 70% of the way there, but that's still not enough to get proficient, so we will continue to be
Correct.
deemed for that.
Yep.
One could potentially argue that the more diverse your district is, you
The
will-
harder it is to succeed with this
Under
grading
this-
scale. You're not going to get an A.
potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
The harder it is to succeed under this growth scale, is that what you're saying?
So if you have a huge diverse district with a lot of ELL kids, especially ones that come in mid-education, right? They don't come when they're 5, they come when they're 8 or 10 or 12 or 15. We don't have enough time to get them proficient, so we will continue to suffer on the grading. We will never be able to get an A because we have a diverse district with a lot of needs. Is special ed the same way, or?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
It all is.
Yeah.
So
One
you
of the
look
things
at,
is
I
our
mean,
subgroups.
to kind of factor this in, and we're only slide 5 and there's about 20, but it's all
Yeah.
right. So,
He does not agree.
yeah, our
That
ELL
must be that
students.
commentary you were talking
I
about.
know, yeah. I said unsolicited. You look at our English language learners who come in with a number of barriers potentially. Our also special education students, reading or math goal means they need increased help in the areas of reading and math. If they were proficient, they most likely would not have set goal. But because they have a goal area in 1, 2, or more than 2 goal areas, means they may not ever get to proficient, or we're working to catch them up. So that's another reason why the growth, it was something that larger diverse districts, valued the fact that we could continue to grow our students year by year.
Okay, but again, so this change by the state still emphasizes that point that you're
It still factors in growth, just not as much.
making,
Not as much.
Now,
So if-
equal with
some degree of,
proficiency.
is there some degree of not as much?
Yeah, well, if you toggle between the two, the point I was going to make was wrong, but the point I was trying to make there is if you look at proficiency, only 8% of the total for high schools in the previous one, 8% of the 100 was proficiency. And then if you look at the new scale, you can see all of these percentages for proficiency. You have proficiency ELA 11%, proficiency math 11%, proficiency science 30%. So now 30% of your score is proficiency, where in the past, looking at those three, it would just been 8%. So there's such a more heavier emphasis on proficiency. So we could grow kids beyond 1 grade level a year, 2 grade levels a year, 3 grade levels a year, depending on where they started, and they won't hit that proficiency cut score.
Okay, but does that also mean that I can't look at the growth result this year and compare it to last year?
So one thing that will be in a future slide is I will caution you on trying to compare previous results to this year's results, given the fact that
Caution,
there's,
so you don't
I
do
would
that.
Yeah.
caution you to
We can still,
try to
But we
compare
could still
between
do
the
that.
2 years.
we can still look at growth. You're-
Because we've done that with some of our buildings already to kind of determine the growth that they made previous year to growth this year. It's just when you're looking at the overall rating, like Lucas is talking about, trying to compare how a school scored this year in comparison to last year, there's too many factors that have changed where that designation starts to get unclear. But you could drill down to specific data points around proficiency or growth and make some comparisons for sure.
Does that mean I also can't look at this district compared to other districts?
Yeah, we're all on the same scale this year, so, just like we shouldn't compare necessarily our results apples to apples, all of us are now on the same scale. Now, whether that impacts larger, more diverse districts, could be said that it has a larger impact on that.
I would also put in here that it's all public schools are on the same scale. Private schools in the state do not report any of this and have no comparison data for anybody to make that choice.
But yeah, you could compare to other districts. I think we'd actually be pretty proud of how our schools
Yeah,
scored in
see that.
comparison when you've looked at some of the other UEN partners and where, in particular, I've seen a lot of reporting about the high schools in comparison to where our high schools fell. And so I think those are positive things for us, even though the labels attached to the schools, seem like they're in trouble in some way.
I'm making comparisons between racial groups.
Yeah, we still do our demographic analysis for sure, Charlie, in those subgroups.
Analysis or this way of analyzing what schools do or what the results are. Does that affect the comparison between racial groups that we've used as comparison to what we've used in the past? In the past, we've mostly compared proficiency between racial groups.
Yeah, what I would say is like for us in our data, you know, our strategic plan goals, when we look at those different goals, we're going to continue to look at, you know, the Iowa assessment results and to determine how our subgroups compare from year to year. That assessment hasn't changed. What they're doing with the data from that assessment and then the scale they're trying to rate our schools on, that has changed. The assessment hasn't, and so we can still do our demographic subgroup data, and we can do comparisons from year to year to see how our schools are performing in those subgroups or just overall. This is a kind of a compilation of a few different things. It's ISAST results, and then Lucas is going to explain some other factors that go into it too. So we can still do all those things, and we still will. That's still part of our work.
And one of the new additions this year as well is science is included. Science was never included in the VAS profiles. It was never something we reported out on. Now students at 4th grade, 8th grade, and was it 10th or 11th?
It's 5th grade, 8th grade. And
Yeah. Excuse me. And those 3 grade levels are the only ones that take the science assessments, not administered at every grade level.
And while we can compare ourselves to other schools, the best comparison would probably be to find districts that had similar ELL percentages and special ed percentages, districts that are more similar to ours. That would be the most useful comparison tool of how we're measuring up, right?
Right. And one of the slides at the very end, we could have broken this down by elementary, middle, and high school, but we used high school and middle school as 2 examples. We're compared by district size as well as where they fell on the index score. And I think there's going to be some glaring things that come out of that, but we wanted to highlight where our 3 schools, and that's I think really positive news, where our schools are at compared to other schools, and you can kind of see what those other schools are within that graphic, but that'll be kind of towards the tail end.
Other school districts.
Other districts, correct. So again, the categories have not changed. The scores and the percent changed, but the 6 categories as far as where schools fell still remains from exceptional to priority to comprehensive. One of the things to note, given the fact that the scale did change this year, buildings, if they're targeted, either 1 year for first year targeted or extended targeted, all those schools started brand new this year. Nobody's ratings or nobody's categorization carried over from 1 year to the next. So that was their way of fulfilling those that concern that was out there, given the fact that there was a new scale used. I thought this, because one of the things you see on there now is attendance growth, looking at your students that are chronically absent. So they obviously take the percentage of your students that are chronically absent in the building. That's part of the percentage with the scale score. One of the things they also include is the percent of students that are chronically absent, the growth of those students. So this graphic shows it probably better than I would be able to explain it. So again, our data was from the 2022-23 school year, but as they started looking through a formula how to determine chronically absenteeism growth, they based upon what a student's attendance was like the previous year and the percent of growth that they have the following year. So based upon the percent of growth and the formula that they use will ultimately determine the percentage of points that you get in that chronically absent category. So I'm going to come back to this one here shortly, but remember the chronically absent, you can get up to 50 points, is that.
And when you're talking about growth, do you mean growth in getting them a better absent rate or growth in proficiency on tests?
It's only the measure of the kids that were chronically absent. So not all students, just students who were chronically absent.
And if we
What is their
if we've
absentee rate?
It's their absentee if we've reduced the amount of times they're missing.
So it factors in pretty much the days present that they were there. And then it adds all those students that are chronically absent, divides it by the increase from 1 year to the next, divided by, what is that? The days enrolled.
But like if your girls were gone 10 days last year and they were gone 0 days this year, that doesn't help us.
Why?
Because they weren't chronically absent.
Oh, okay. But if they were chronically absent last year,
And then they
and
missed.
then the next year they weren't,
Yeah.
that helps. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So are all schools in the state using the same definition of chronic absence?
Correct.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a state requirement. How they
Kind of.
determine it, yes.
Kind of.
Yes, that's-
I mean, we all are dealing with
The
the same
baseline.
state definition of 10%, 15%, and measuring it by, well, no, yes, we are, yes, they are.
But you're
because-
right, because so if we go back to that attendance stuff, there was those local determination pieces, and there was some talk on our team at the time, it wouldn't have been friendly to our families, but knowing this was gonna be put into our rating system, we could have taken a much harder line approach with our families to inspire better attendance, right? And those may be some evolutions of those conversations to say, would we, and we haven't vetted this out much yet, but for a chronically absent student, would we take a different approach than our overall attendance policy, right? Would we be more extreme to try to inspire them to get into school more? Now, again, we're limited on, what do we do, right, from an intervention perspective with that student, other than to say there's consequences. I mean, we're already providing the support we can around those attendance ones. This is going to be really hard to get movement on, I think, not just for us, for anybody in the state. But there would be some local determinations we could make about what we allow to be considered exempt or non-exempt. And the idea would be, if you allow fewer of those things to be exempt, then you would get into attendance meetings with families quicker to try to inspire better attendance, right? But from an overall system perspective, that didn't seem very friendly or kind or reasonable to our families to start with the most hardline approach.
Because even exempt absences count towards chronic absenteeism. So even if we have a kiddo who has a medical condition that keeps them out of school for a significant portion of time, they're still going to be flagged as chronically absent.
Because they're still not present,
Because they're still not present. So it may be a legitimate reason.
right? It's
But
just,
there's-
did we decide to
Yeah.
exempt more things than we would have had to,
And that's why we can't do a lot of, we can't make sick kids healthy.
right?
We
They're
can't do
chronically absent at the state level, but not chronically absent at
district.
the local level.
Cool.
Speaking of cool,
Yeah.
here's
That's
another thing.
all we can say.
Here's another thing that was very cool, as far as the changes that were made. Again, we talked about those 6 categories. The names of the 6 categories did not change. But one of the things that they added to the profile of the category that was spit out for each of the schools was dropping a category if you were targeted in one or more subgroups. So we have, as you'll see from the data here in a little bit, the highest rated district and the largest districts have the highest percent of students targeted in the subgroups of FRL, IEP, as well as ELL status and Black African American students. So again, you tend to see that in larger, more diverse districts. If we have any of our schools that are automatically targeted in those areas, they automatically drop a level 2. So what I'm going to show you on the comparisons to previous years to this year is, because as a public-facing thing, this is something that people don't necessarily see unless you get into the details of the index scores and where they fall on the categories. But this, again, was something that was, that they felt that they received that they received feedback and agreement that this was something that they would do to move forward if a school is targeted. So again, if you're not looking at the details of the scores, you would see, holy cow, Iowa City had X amount of schools in commendable, acceptable, high-performing areas in the past. This year, that's not the case. What happened over the course of 1 year? And you'll kind of see how that'll look with our categories. So when we break down our 28 attendance centers, so you don't see Hills necessarily on here this year, you see where our buildings fall both at each of the levels. So the elementaries, that's important since we looked at last year's. This includes 6th grade data in the future. 6th grade data will not be at the elementaries, it will be used at the middle schools. And I'll kind of talk through some pieces there. But you can kind of see where our buildings fell in terms of the 6 categories. The thing that you will see next is where those buildings and where our total district ratings are for the 23-24 school year compared to the 21-22, 22-23. And then if they did not use the criteria that if you were a targeted building that you would drop a category, where our numbers would fall, okay? And that'll make sense here in this one. So again, that far left is just all those numbers that were on the previous slide, just added up all 3 levels. You see the comparison data from the previous 2 years. Again, I cautioned you about trying to compare from 1 year to the next. But if we were to stay strict to the comparison of if they did not factor in larger diverse districts have a higher tendency to be targeted in different subgroups. If they did not drop categories automatically we would see a shift or transition into the more commendable and acceptable ranges. So that orange category, again, is not factoring in if we're automatically dropped a level for our targeted subgroups. In the next slide, you'll see kind of where the breakdown of all of our buildings are, that if they are targeted, what are the subgroups that they are targeted in. But does that slide make sense? Again,
The orange is kind of made up,
the orange is where,
is
yeah,
what we would hope, or
yeah,
what we.
if they didn't change that.
or Something.
If they didn't do the automatic drop of a
Yeah,
level, that's where we would have.
Not made up, but
Yeah.
yes.
So,
What could have been.
so the orange is just if they didn't do the
If
automatic
they did
drop,
not.
but the number calculation stays the same.
Yeah,
Like the
so,
weighting stays the
so
same.
what I did, I took.
Yeah, we didn't go back and
Yeah.
recalculate.
We took the
everybody.
raw
Oh,
score,
okay.
what
Yeah.
their score was.
I
Okay.
took a look at what's used as the index score for each of our buildings, that regardless if they're targeted or not, because that in the past didn't necessarily matter, if they were not targeted based on their index score, where would they fall? That's in the orange. So optically, if you were just to look, like, holy cow, what happened in Iowa City over the course of 1 year? You went from 11 and acceptable in 21, 22, and all of a sudden it dipped to 11 now needs improvement.
So those are the interesting numbers. What do they actually mean? The education of students.
So, one beg that, what does that mean? I mean, I turned that question, I don't necessarily have that answer. What does mean for buildings that get towards a priority comprehensive, there are certain specifics that those buildings must participate in with the state if they are prioritized as comprehensive buildings. The other buildings, not necessarily, unless you're a targeted subgroup, there's work that all those targeted buildings have to do. But if you're anywhere from needs improvement to exceptional, your day-to-day function doesn't necessarily look any different. The prioritized buildings have a little bit more kind of expectations or work that they have to do along the way with our Department of Ed.
It's kind of like we're the government, we're here to help type motto. I think, Charlie, a little bit like we already have strategies employed. You know, we already know where our proficiency rates set. We already know where our growth factors are. We're already doing teaching learning strategies and implementing systems to try to address those and seeing some success in those areas, right? The additional level of support that comes from the DE is submitting, a comprehensive plan by February that then we turn around and assess again April, May timeframe. So you can imagine what kind of impact a plan submitted in February is going to have for any kind of outcome change that we would see in April and May. So we cannot be dependent upon what the state's asking us to do to drive this change, right? This is why we already invest in good work and the important work throughout the year, because we needed to start day one in August about what our kids needed, right? We can't wait to get labeled and then wait for support to come from the department to say, here's how we can help you improve. And the other thing is, it's not like there's some strategy they're going to share that we're unaware of at this point, right? And so that's where I think we'd fall back to the systems we already have in place that we're trying to do.
When we take a look at the stats, I mean, these were shared with us. They had a webinar the day after we were informed of the embargo that the profiles were released. They had a webinar with the buildings and the districts that have targeted buildings to kind of walk us through next steps. They shared this additional data as part of that webinar. So again, I think it speaks to the larger districts had the greatest impact of change with this, and not necessarily change for the positive. But you look at just under 30% of Iowa schools are targeted, and you kind of see where again, we talked about the 4 different subgroups that are the most heavily targeted: IEP, ELL, our Black African American students in our free and reduced status. When we take a look at our larger districts of 7,500 or more students, almost 53% of our larger districts are targeted.
Tell me again what targeted actually means.
So performing in the lower 5% of schools across the state. In that
So
subgroup.
it's only a statement about the assessment of student
Yeah,
proficiency.
that student subgroup, if they score within the bottom 5% of other schools.
When you say bottom 5%, do you mean
Lower 5%.
percent of proficiency in all
Yeah,
areas?
I believe it's
or-
proficiency, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that,
Or do you know that you have to have 20 or more students?
Correct.
You have to have an N size of 20, so there are a lot of districts
yeah.
that don't have, in a building, that don't have an N size of 20.
So
We're only
then they
targeted
wouldn't
on proficiency, right? Not on
rewarded.
growth.
Correct.
Correct.
One of the things that did say, like, sixth graders were factored into elementary
why
last year,
seems
this
like
next year will be factored into middle school, so if we see any big changes, we could see some of our elementary schools that may not meet the end sample size for some of those subgroups because of one grade level moving from the elementary to middle.
Should we aggregate students within each category across the district? And we're looking for district results in education.
I'm not sure I understand your question, Charlie.
As I understand it, what the state is presenting, it says don't consider proficiency of students who are they're under 20 students in a building,
In a subgroup.
in a subgroup.
In a
Is that
subgroup,
right?
in that, yeah.
So district-wide, that could be 400 students.
Because the statuses are designated by building. So each building receives a designation. And so we don't have like a district designation. That's what each individual building would have one. And so we can't combine. All of those are combined when we look at our subgroup data overall as a district, which we do, and we'll present that data in our annual progress report in December. So that's where we'll see all of that data.
Okay, so we will.
We still look at that, absolutely, yes. We look at our district overall and how we're performing by subgroup. But for this, it looks at each individual building. And so if the building does not have it, so in elementary school, we're probably going to see a difference next year because we won't have our sixth graders. And so only our third, fourth, and fifth graders are being tested, or will be included in these reports. So there may be some of our buildings that do not have an N of 20 in subgroups.
Do we know how many buildings are?
We don't know yet. I mean, that's something we'll have to take.
We
a
have,
look
I
at.
mean, we would have to dig, we haven't pulled that information, but.
One thing, if you haven't seen it or clicked on the link, would be to go to the, I know some of you have, would be the DE page for this that lists out all the buildings, and then that says their specific targeted or non-targeted status right in those. I mean, I don't know, it's not funny, but when you think about the targeted status on proficiency and that IEP students are targeted or were dropped a level because of their proficiency, I mean, the whole way our identification model is set now in the state of Iowa is based on some non-proficiency factors to qualify for special education. So by qualifying for special education, we're recognizing they're not proficient. But then we're making, as part of the rating system, you're dropping the whole school's performance level based on a category of students you know are in that program because they are non-proficient. Same thing with ELL, right? They would no longer be classified as English language learner students if they had passed out of English language learner programming, to a proficient level. So it's hard not to feel caught for our system, and I think us as leaders, right, try to communicate the right message, but you can tell also why it's deflating for our staff, right? I mean, they're working with these students each and every day and understand where their skill level is, and so then when it's dropping a whole school level performance and categorizing the achievements of the whole school as less than because of a group of students they know are in those programs because they need the support, it just doesn't make sense to people, right?
And we'll just, I caution again not to get too far into the weeds here looking at specific schools. I mean, that's obviously work that we'll be doing with our schools. The remaining part of this year is what are we going to do to help impact the students in each of those subgroups. But may not be able to see it very well on this, but looking at our buildings where they fall within the categories, and then with each building, if they are targeted, have those different symbols listed after their name. If you see nothing after a school's name, that means that they were not targeted in any subgroup, either because they did not meet the sample size or their students outperformed other schools in the same. One of the other changes that happened this year is buildings in the past, if they were targeted over the course of 3 years, and it was they were not able to get off the targeted list until after those 3 years. One of the rationale for pushing everything up, and you'll kind of see where these timelines have been shifted up drastically over the course of multiple months, is that buildings on a yearly basis can either be added to a targeted list or be removed from a targeted list based upon their performance, the statewide assessments, as well as their criteria meeting with absenteeism, graduation, everything else. So, if you're to look at the positive positives of some of the changes that were made, this is a positive because the building was targeted now based upon their work this year and student performance at the statewide assessments and their work at the end of the year can ultimately get them off the targeted list at the end of the school year. So that, again, that was one of the rationales for them. Instead of the same in the action planning, I'll be doing May and June, they're not doing February. So we have a number of next steps here that goes along with this. Grantwood remains a point of support for these, so I know that's, Grantwood's role changing. How does that look with this process? They will remain a process and a partner with our work here moving forward. We do have to participate in what's called the Required District Resource Allocation Review, the RAR. So that includes district leadership as well as buildings who are targeted. We go through a number of things about where we're spending our time and people and money. We'll kind of go through that review. The DE gave us 4 dates that they will open up the webinar, and then kind of Grantwood and the district kind of leads that process. So that will remain the same as well. We have worked, and we've got all these dates now set up, so we will go through the data review process, and that's individual targeted buildings will go through this. We also, even though the majority of our buildings are targeted in one or more subgroups, we also find some benefit in this process, so we will actually be having all of our buildings participate in this this year. Again, it forces them to examine a number of different things that go on in their building, and the team of people that they have around the table really can have some really good conversations about what they're doing in their building and what are some potential changes that they can make based upon their school's data. So the RAR is the one thing we'll do with, I think, December 3rd, is that the date we said?
Yeah.
December 3rd, again, we just clarified that today. The data review with the teams will be Monday the 2nd, in addition
just
to...
Lucas,
Yeah.
with that district resource allocation review, an excellent lobbying point that probably won't go anywhere with this legislature would be they're going to ask us how we're committing resources, right, to do this. And think RAM for us, right? Like disproportionate allocation of resources to the schools that are there. Well, how long have we talked about an equity number into the funding formula in the state of Iowa? And if you're going to label your schools differently based on the fact that they have these subgroups that are not growing or not performing at proficiency is great, then why aren't they allocating their resources differently to those school districts, right? So the school districts that aren't there, if they're going to expect us to allocate resources differently to the schools, then what about to the districts, right? I mean, that would seem to make a strong connection that you would want to disproportionately allocate funds to your districts that aren't. If you're saying they're the lowest performers, then why aren't we sending more resources that way? And I think that ties back to that equity part of the formula that we've never gotten any movement on from the state.
So you're talking about the fact that the current formula doesn't recognize free and reduced price lunch.
Right, that it's just equal, right? We've talked about that. It's one of the most equal in the nation, but it's not equitable, right? If it was equitable, then Iowa City would be funded at a higher rate than Solon.
What is the point of doing all of this if you're not going to give us more resources?
Right, but you expect us, you're going to do a resource allocation review with us to make sure we're trying to allocate resources differently to those buildings with the fixed pot you give us, just like.
Asking for allocation of resources to students.
Sorry?
We're really asking for allocation of resources to students, not to us.
Right, and that's what it is, right? Through the formula, I think that's where you tie that point, right? Is, okay, give it to the students that need
I
it.
think that is important.
Yeah, that's probably an important semantics of the language, exactly.
Again, the importance of this slide is really just looking at the fact that all this information and all these meetings that we tend to have through the winter and the spring has now been pushed up, and given the fact that we've got a couple of different breaks coming up, the window of time is very narrow right now. So we have pushed those all up, and we'll have everything needs to be submitted to the state by February 3rd. One of the other large changes, and this will probably solicit quite a deal of conversation, this is where a lot of the bulk of the work over the course of the last week has been, is really trying to get a good understanding of what the work, the post-secondary readiness. If you remember on the front slide, this is one of the things that continued as part of the index score that's spit out, and ultimately your profile that's there. One of the things you see in that top orange box, post-secondary readiness included a number of things. But one of the things that Iowa City scored fairly well on in the past was ACT and SAT, number of students participating in those tests, as well as the success of the students when they did take the test. And we had very successful students. We had, a lot of our students that are looking to attend college a 4-year or 2-year after they graduate from our system, and they found those beneficial to go where they want to go. That is no longer used to determine anything with post-secondary readiness. When I asked the state, what was the rationale for some of these changes, is the state has put a large emphasis on the work-based learning that goes on, which again, I think is great. And they're also saying that a lot of universities and colleges across the country are now making this optional, no longer a requirement. So that was the rationale for no longer having it as part of the criteria for how our buildings were scored. CTE courses, that was the number of students that were enrolled in those courses, as well as college level and post-secondary advanced coursework. Again, those were all factors used in the past. There are now 3 different areas for how our schools have been scored with that post-secondary readiness. Again, we're only talking about high schools here. The first of it being college credit, so the students in high school, so they take a look at seniors over the course of the 4 years, what types of opportunities did they participate in while enrolled in their high schools. So this included classes either at Kirkwood, at the university, or classes that occur within our building that they get concurrent enrollment for. So enrollment is one piece. The second of which is not necessarily participation in an AP class, but how well the students do on the AP exam. So scoring a 3 or higher is what the state is now using as part of their index score for the college credit. Again, not students enrolled, which some other key pieces of data and rankings across the country use as participation of your students in those classes. This only takes a look now at students' score on there. We do not require students that are in the AP classes to take the AP exam.
Not yet.
We also, exactly. So when we talk about next steps, there are some realistic next steps that we need to start considering. Also, you could be a student enrolled in a class at Kirkwood or at the University of Iowa that's also offered as an AP class in high school, but you lend yourself to take the AP exam. You don't have to be enrolled in an AP course at the high school to take the AP exam. Like that's only we don't have a lot of students that do that. But again, this criteria now sets aside, we only care about how you score on the AP exam.
You don't have to be enrolled in a course to take the
Correct.
Yeah. No.
So how many students take the exam?
We don't have that data for you, Charlie, but I think that's one thing, before we say that if you're in an AP class, you have to take the test, the other thing we'd have to figure out is cost, right? Like a lot of those costs get turned around to the family, and we do, of course, help our free and reduced price lunch families, pay for that either at a free or a reduced rate. But making that a requirement of the course probably changes that with a conversation with a family, that then we're telling them that they have to pay for the exam because we are going to have to take on paying for the exams for every kid if we want that to be the expectation.
I'm not suggesting, frankly, that I think we should get 100% of students to take the AP exam. I'm wondering if that percentage now is 25% of students?
No, I understood your question. I was just probably going with some of the things we talked about. So we'll have to figure that out and know.
I don't think it's 75% of
Yeah.
students.
I know my kids have taken several where they haven't taken the exam at the end.
You'd have to break it down by number of tests and also number of students. You'll have some students that take in a year in May 4
Right, so-
tests. So the question,
A student may take 5 exams.
Mhm.
So it's just 10 students may take 0 exams.
Yeah,
Right.
we have that. I mean, we just don't have it. Yeah, I mean, they have that.
That's okay.
Yeah.
The work-based learning category, that middle piece, is very wordy, and it still doesn't necessarily make sense to me. So if you're not looking at this every day, I don't know how it makes sense to you either, but maybe you're much more intelligent than myself. But this is one of the things that we're looking into right now. We're taking a look at what we're currently offering, and sometimes it's just as simple as coding the class differently, or it's using different flags that go along with the course. So it's a simple organizational managerial piece. And there's different criteria, and you'll see that here on the next slide, so I'll come back to that middle piece. One of the things that's going to be factored into ratings this coming year is what's called industry recognized credentialing, which doesn't necessarily take a part of anything that a school's doing, but credentialing that students can participate in either through the state or other institutions. Before these were even released, we've been having early conversations about what does credentialing look like, and can we partner with a local college or university to do so, but those come at a cost. The state offers some free of charge, the state offers some at a low cost, and there's colleges that are now getting into it that are offering them at cost as well. So one of the questions that we've been going back and forth with one of our reps that did the webinar was, what does this look like? How do we know students that participate in the credentialing? Is it attached to their state ID number? And if these are things that come at a cost, what are we going to do to provide these to students, no matter what their circumstance is? Will that be made available for them, or is it something that they have to buy into or pay for? So again, we don't have that. They don't have a whole lot of information either, to be honest with you. At least it hasn't been shared with us about what that credentialing looks like. Like, there are some really good benefits from it. Like, one of the things that I've tried to ask is, like, if you're a kid in a family that's coming into high school, they're asking, why would I do this? An easy thing to kind of give the elevator speech of why a student participating in credentialing. It looks good on a resume. It looks good on a resume if you're going to college or not going to college, part of the application process. And some of these, depending upon how extensive you get, could be used towards either certification or apprenticeship or a job that comes along with it after. Again, I don't have a whole lot of information just because a whole lot of information hasn't been shared with that. Mitch?
Do these other two only apply to seniors in high school, or is it like so that the denominator is every student in the building?
I believe it's all of the students in the high schools.
So they're expecting first-year students in high school to have they're part of the denominator on an industry-recognized credential.
Yeah, I believe so. I mean, like Lucas was saying, these two are clear because they're courses, and so we can figure out SCED codes and courses. This is unclear. What counts as work-based learning? Like, we need a definition. We need really clear criteria. And then this, I mean, you know, they talked about it's not even included yet. Well, what's an industry recognized credential? Because it's kind of credentials and then certifications. But the thing I want you guys to be thinking about, this is probably our opportunity with the CFI, right? I mean, like, we could turn the Center for Innovation into, you know, basically a place where kids could get tons of credentials, tons of certifications, right? There's an opportunity, I think, to link some of that work in what we're doing there.
When you say, when it's winter student report, the winter SRI student reporting in Iowa, it's the database for those that have no affiliation with the Department of Ed. But is that only looking at what days our students expect? Is it anywhere from August start date to what's the end date that they have to have a work-based learning experience by? Do we know, or?
Good question.
Okay, no, just, if you don't.
Yeah, so
that's
whenever
fine.
that SRI pull is in the winter, the way I read that, I mean, we'll have to follow up, would be if they're enrolled at the report out of that winter SRI.
That's how they define it broader than that. In the technical document, it just says while in high school.
So it could be summer.
Could be somewhere.
Or it could, right, so if you take it your sophomore year, do we get credit for them during their junior and senior year because they've already taken it?
Again, this is the area, again, the state has put a lot more emphasis with some of the bills that were passed last year. This isn't something brand new that we're still trying to wrap our heads around. I'll come back to that middle column again, because to be considered work-based learning and sort of part of the post-secondary readiness in the past was a lot easier, is a bad term to say, but I'm going to say easier to fulfill those requirements than they are maybe now. What you'll see on the next couple slides here is where our buildings fall with the post-secondary readiness. So the orange line up at the top there, the top part is where you see college credit. And then again, we talked about two different factors with post-secondary readiness that were used for this year's categorization. The first of which, college credit, again, University of Iowa, Kirkwood classes that they're enrolled in, either off campus or in our buildings, in addition to them scoring a 3 or higher on the AP. So that was used to determine the state average with college credit. So you can see two of our three comprehensive high schools are above the state average. One of them is a little bit below the state average. So that's that top line. The second line is where you see the work that we have to do. You saw the state average, again, the work-based learning and all the criteria used to fulfill those experiences. State average right around 25. Our highest building is actually our online program, just under 8, and our West High just under 7. So again, these are there's some easy wins on this and easy growth just based on how we categorize and how we flag certain things. But you can see this is an area of focus that we've already begun discussions with our administrators and just internally about what we need to start considering with this.
How is the state average 25%?
Well, I think part of Our frustration would be in larger districts. We haven't,
Yeah.
I haven't yet dug into what other UEN districts are doing here. I do think our scores are low here and there's work we need to do, and part of that's attributed to what Lucas said about the courses. But the model we have for a lot of these right now is workplace learning connections, and if you've ever looked at the amount of opportunities they can create versus the volume of students we have, it's totally misaligned, right? I mean, like our need is so much greater than, and they're good partners and they're trying real hard, but our need is so far beyond what they can do that we have to determine some local solutions here to that. So I think some of the systems and structures set up in the state aren't set up for large urban districts to accomplish this, so we're going to have to identify some of those. I also feel like another frustrating part of this one is like the test came out and we weren't told we were going to be tested on this. We might have been told we were going to be tested on post-secondary readiness, but nothing about how we were going to define work-based learning and what we would look for there. Otherwise, of course, we would have looked at our sched codes of our courses. We would have looked for more opportunities ahead of time to do this. That should be work we're doing anyways, and I think, again, connected to some of the other conversations we've had. But one for us is, hey, it'd be nice to know how you were going to score us before you start pulling this data and then showing that, oh, we're this low, right? So
The next few slides of what you're going to see here is kind of some comparison of our high schools and our district schools in comparison to others across the state. So here on this you see kind of the UEN comparison. You saw, I think it's 22 or 24 is what I included on here. So you see the state average there along the left-hand side, and that's where those dotted lines, those same state averages that you
I
saw
forgot you
in the
did have that
previous
one.
slide. Then the Iowa cities, well, that's the first one. So the rest you see alphabetically, but you see Iowa City there at the beginning. Kind of all over the place as far as where the results are. But one thing that you probably see is a lot of our larger UEN schools either hover right at the state average or a little bit below it, or in great ways below it. And these are conversations, again, as we're working through to understand a little bit more about that work-based learning piece, is what those larger districts that are comparable size and comparable demographic stuff, what are they doing that we need to consider? And is it as simple as categorizing and flagging certain things within our database?
Waukee and Westmoreland,
Yeah.
whatever they're doing.
So, kind of some next steps that we're looking at, kind of just immediately, really looking at auditing our classes, and Carmen's gone through our high school program of studies in particular. Are they categorized appropriately? And I talked about 6 indicators that they use for the middle category of their work-based learning. And these are the criteria that they have to be met within a class. Again, sometimes in the past it was just like simply exposure to a class or exposure to a profession. It takes away the vagueness of exposure. Now it has to be something tangible that students do within a class. Apprenticeships, maybe not as robust as what we would consider an official apprenticeship. Internships, a project-based learning that's attached to a curriculum, either to a profession or to an industry. So a lot of things that are changing. There are some simple, I shouldn't say simple because it's going to take work, but it's not necessarily changing courses that we're offering, but maybe looking at some of the curriculum that's added as part of that. Can we embed some of these pieces in classes that already exist within our system to make them fulfill some of the criteria that's now used for work-based learning? And I hate to say it that way because that seems like we're just chasing after a point, but there are some beneficial experiences that our kids will gain as part of it as well. So I hate to say that I'm looking at that in a positive light. But also one of the things we're looking to do, we know when kids have to leave to either Kirkwood or the University of Iowa, for them to leave campus as a barrier. Either they want to be around their friends or transportation, even though we help with that. So we're
Or
looking
time in their school day.
Or time in the school day, because
It
it's so
takes
packed,
time,
because
yeah.
it takes time to travel. There are some courses that are offered at the university or at the Kirkwood campus that we can then offer back in our building. So we begin those discussions, and the ability to be able to be what's considered an adjunct professor at Kirkwood is a little bit more feasible now than what it was in the past. So can we offer some of those courses either in place of, because Kirkwood only has a small amount of space to begin with, so we can offer those in our buildings. It's a win-win for everybody. So we began those discussions with Kirkwood about getting some of our staff that are able to do that, to teach those courses, and if they are not, let's identify those staff members and can we do some incentives to be able to have them do that. I think AP additional courses, we actually looked at one today, so courses that are now being offered as an AP course, so we're going to start to think through, are there additional courses that we may need to consider. We have our regular pathway, we have an honors, we have our AP track. So not necessarily taking away opportunities, but can some opportunities meet the same, fulfillment for the families?
I know we recently added some CTE facilities to City High. Are the other two high schools up to the same level for career and technical ed? I'm just thinking of some of this work because a lot of this seems to be focused on that area.
Yeah, I mean, they all have a little different setup in the CTE areas. We've done work, obviously, Liberty's, when it was constructed, was outfitted with the different CTE areas we were committed to at the time. City High's is kind of like a bring back project. We're bringing back a lot of those areas. West High, has some of the CTE areas, but I would say that's an area we're going to need to continue to grow with those different campuses as we identify these opportunities and what are the on-site things we would need to try to continue to build or grow potentially there. So.
And again, those things that I think needed are things that we're already in the process of working through. Kind of the forward-thinking ones and discussions that we need to have more broadly, because it would be somewhat of a shift in what our current practice is. We'll be looking at that AP test if that becomes not an option but a requirement. More project-based learning as part of the classes, embedding that. If there's some immediate things we could do or future things we need to start thinking of with the scope and sequence of the curriculum within those courses. And then Brady, do you want to talk through that last piece, because this is kind of a conversation.
I think one opportunity, AP exams are the first 2 weeks in May, and we still have, after they finish a month of school, and a lot of the students, they finish the curriculum of the course, and they are also students who oftentimes have a full schedule, they're involved in extracurriculars, and they don't have a lot of time. So we thought it might be a good opportunity to take that time post-AP exam and really expose them to job shadowing or credentialing. You've got a group of students who might not otherwise do it, who probably would benefit and would be willing, and I think teachers would be excited about being able to do that and not facing, some teachers struggle maybe more than others with that month after the test with students.
So how about giving equal emphasis to students that are not going to do AP stuff? Because there are a lot of, as you know, there are a lot of trade unions now.
Yeah.
Really working hard to get apprenticeship programs that high school students can participate in.
Yeah.
And I know we're working with those groups now. But
Yeah, I think that's what we want to come back and talk to you about, Charlie, is like, what's the strategy for all, right? I think our goal should be, how could all kids leave the Iowa City Community School District with these experiences, right? Like, what's their takeaway package that says, hey, I've been credentialed, or I've been certified, or I've had this menu of experiences while I've been here, right? Our goal shouldn't be just to try to get to that average line where the rest are. It's, okay, how do we create the best system possible in those areas? And I think we've primed some conversations just because of other projects we've worked on to be kind of well positioned to think about that now in this light, to know, okay, well, if we're going to get scored on it too, and we've already identified it as good positive work that kids should have opportunities to, how do we ramp this thing up, right? And so I think that was just one small example. We thought, hey, there's a subgroup of kids that might be actually one of the hardest to capture in these different experiences. So
Lastly, the next couple of slides you'll see is where our schools fall in comparison to others. And first, what Matt said at the very beginning was that this is one indicator of both what's going well in our system as well as some areas of growth. That's how we always treat whenever we get the Iowa School Performance Profile. We don't hang our hat on the fact that a school is this, or this. But it does solicit really good conversation, causes some reflection based on the data that they're using to start planning proactively for the coming year. But what we'll see here, this first one, is just comparison of our high schools. Again, on the y-axis there you see the student count. The larger buildings are there across the top, and the x-axis across the bottom is that index score that's ultimately used to kind of create the ranking or the category for each of the schools. So you'll see, we should be pretty proud of where our three comprehensive high schools are at in comparison to others around the chart there.
Would point out that all three high schools are a commendable rating if it wasn't for the
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So again, Justin Justin Colbert was like, hey, have you looked at this? And that was last Thursday or Friday when I spoke to him. And then thinking through, this is a really good visual that shows where our buildings are at. Like that work-based learning, that stings there. And that shows a really prioritized area that we need to focus on. But when we take a look at the overall performance of our buildings, like this speaks to the work that we're doing, and I think we should be fairly proud of where our buildings are, especially when we take a look at the other buildings that are kind of circle around there, so. And then, I apologize to Eliza, I did not do this for the elementary schools, just because I don't have the
You don't
visual
what?
capability to do so.
Okay,
Too many arrows.
Yes, too many arrows, way too many arrows.
that's fair.
But you'll kind of see where our middle schools are in comparison to the others as well. So the middle schools you see are all the pink circles there on the screen, which very close to treatment facilities. I'm not sure why they chose very similar colors between those two.
Good point, I didn't notice that.
For a
Yeah.
middle school person,
Yeah.
I'm terribly offended by
Yeah.
the fact that they use very similar colors.
What is that about?
Yeah. So that's the data there. So
Wow, and it's 5:30.
yeah.
You want to give the two clarifiers we worked on, Will?
Yeah, so just two clarifying pieces. When we were talking about those subgroups that were targeted, they look at that subgroup and give them a score based off of all of the criteria. So it's not just proficiency. And so the 6 criteria that it was looking at was the proficiency, the growth, the attendance rate, the attendance growth. So they'll take that subgroup and run that whole formula, and if that subgroup's scored at or below the 5%, then they would have been targeted. So it took all of those categories.
That's how they're making the determination on the subgroup.
Correct. And then there was a little discussion around funding. So just to be clear, there is some funding that does come to our buildings that are targeted. However, that is tied to Title I. So it's actually Title I School Improvement 1003 are the dollars that we receive. If a building is targeted and receives Title I services, they get some money that they need to utilize that ties directly back to the action plan that they make. But if you're familiar with our Title I program, we do not serve our secondary schools with Title I dollars. We can if we chose to, but we have found, and we firmly believe, we can review this if we need to, but we have firmly believed that we want to put those dollars with our students as they're younger and intervene when kids that are our youngest kids. So we typically serve our K through 3 kids first, and then 4 and 5, and so all of our Title I dollars are utilized with our staff in the elementary. And so some of the elementary schools that are targeted and receive Title I services do receive some school improvement dollars, but our secondary schools would not, because we do not serve them with Title I.
So are we going to be able to survive publicity around this?
I believe so. I actually got quite a bit of positive feedback off the communication yesterday that I think people were appreciative of understanding, a little bit bigger picture perspective. And I think, part of our job is to continue again to share that this is one measure, but all of the other positive things that, have happened in the school community and that continue to happen. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to not just let this be the story, right? We've had the school snapshots for a long period of time for that reason. The part where if there's any fairness I'd want to provide to the state is I don't understand what pressure they get to what they have to put in their plan, what are the obligations that they have to include to have it approved and submitted to the federal government. And of course, we're going to have a new president again in January that's talked a lot about changes to the Department of Ed. And so I don't think we have any good read of how that will impact any of this work either. And it's probably a waste of time to speculate right now. But that is the one thing, they've had a lot of emphasis on attendance, at state level conversation. I'm not sure. I also see a lot of communication from the United States Department of Ed about focus on attendance, so that could be a pressure point for them. I know the director is passionate about special ed achievement in the state, and so I think that'll be a continual thing that's linked to us at every turn about what we do there. Obviously with the changes to the AEA and some of the work that I know she wants to lead in our districts to try to engender some improvement and achievement there, I could see some changes continuing to come that way. But I still do think a nice lobbying point for us when we get to the legislators, is linking back to, okay, if we want to continue to have our schools ranked and sorted, then what are they doing, on the legislative end to try to allocate resources differently, other than the one example, Eliza was able to provide there, so.
Well, looking forward to us to continue to use proficiency data, which is actually included in the state's data sets, to assess how we're doing with different groups.
Yeah, we'll continue to do that. That's what so we'll come back on kind of the takeaway here is then, of course, we'll share some of this again on December 10th. But I think some of the questions you've asked about tonight, Charlie, are really going to be through that annual progress report and the data, we always report out to you there about how our students are performing in our schools.
Yeah, I guess that's like kind of my big question. And Charlie's asking all the questions, what does this mean for our students, right? Which it doesn't mean anything for our students. Like, I don't think the intent of this is to help students. I feel like the intent of it is to give us a black eye. So I guess my question is, what is the carrot and or the stick that they're using if we continue to have terrible grades from the state?
So one of the things that, if you're targeted for multiple years, you drop down 2 categories. And and then another thing that automatically drops you down a category, we had it in one of our buildings, if you do not meet 95% participation in all of your groups in addition to your subgroups, which an administrator at testing time, it is going to people's houses to ensure that, because 1, 2, or 3 people in the subgroup make a huge difference between being either docked a category or not. And that's one of the things we're working through, is looking through all the special education students in a building that did not test and aligning our list to see what are the students who are the ones that did not test, because 2 or 3 students in that subgroup would make the difference between them dropping a category or not.
And
So
we had that happen.
Yep.
I mean, we had a building that
Yep.
didn't get 95% of their special ed science test done, and so they dropped a level for that, and then also for a targeted, so they dropped 2 levels.
So I get, so in the end, it's PR,
Mhm.
and that's it, right? Like,
Well, it's hard not to see it connected to school choice, right? Where the
Yeah.
districts that are most vulnerable to school choice are the ones that are performing the lowest on this. I think in the best frame to answer your question, Sean, the thing I'm the most excited about is the post-secondary readiness stuff. I think we have some cool things we can do there. I think we have a mandate, if you will, to do those things, right? And so I think that there are some good things we can do there. And of course, if we can better align post-secondary plans for kids, we want to do that. As far as, do I have a high degree of confidence that this performance measure and the plan the state will put in place is what's going to impact our achievement? I don't have a high degree of confidence of that. I have a high degree of confidence that the things we're already putting into place having an impact in that, right? And I think that'll be a little bit of a documentation exercise that we need to provide back about what are all those things we're implementing as a system.
yeah, so to bring it home, like, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that we're gonna do all the things because we care about what's good for the students. And we're gonna do better on that score because of all the things we do. And it's going to just turn it around and say, despite the fact that you gave us this stupid new rating system, we're still successful, so take that.
So there.
So it'll be our PR in a positive way.
Yep.
It's also just our engagement in a positive way about this. Because, even this past weekend, I had a get-together and someone approached me about it. They were looking at their elementary school for their 2-year-old already. And they are going to these things. And I'm just like, okay, this is the background of the school. Go meet the principal. You'll love it. That is the main, and that's part of us as a board, us as a community. And, it also just, and the real frustrating for me is that when I'm looking at it, it was Man, Longfellow, and Horn. They're all within 2 points. Man was within 0.05 points of being commendable. And if they had been commendable, they would now be acceptable. But because they missed that 0.05 point,
Acceptable, so now
and then
they're-
had the one subgroup,
needs improvement.
they're now needs improvement.
So it's not a very good assessment of the school overall.
No, like if you get on the
And
That's
the
the
thing
setup.
is
It's more
next year,
interaction
I
with the
bet you
state.
it'll look way
Yeah.
different, because
Yeah.
with the loss of their 6th graders, I would be shocked if they
I'll come back
have
to
some
that.
subgroups that have 20 kids in order to be able to have that.
Yeah.
So it's gonna be hard for us next year, even to compare next year's data to this year's, because our 6th graders are gonna be included in that middle school, so those will look different and.
The-
I guess,
Go ahead, Jace.
you said that kind of the so what's the stick is like,
the lower you are in the level, the more interaction you have to have with the state.
Yep.
So in all honesty, right, like, so
From
it's
a-
kind of like our budget
The
thing,
more
right? Like,
plans you have to write.
Yeah, the more time away from students, the time more away from the buildings for our principals, the more time we have to spend in meetings, and so there are some ramifications, and so I think that's why, not that you're suggesting we just like not do it, but, oh, I shouldn't say that, I don't know what you're saying.
It was a
But, I mean, I think that is the stick, is, look, unless you want us up in your business, you gotta take care of business.
All right, we've gone a little bit over, so thank you. I respect everybody's time. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn?
thanks,
All in
everybody.
favor?